The iron door slammed shut, and the sound it made was nothing like the theatre. In the theatre, doors closed with purpose, a gasp from the audience, a shift in the plot, a lover departing or a villain arriving. This door simply shut, metal against metal, a bolt driven home. And then silence of the kind that has weight. The cell smelled of carbolic soap and something older, something human and sour that no amount of scrubbing could remove. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, caged in wire, casting a light that flattened everything it touched. There was a cot, a blanket folded with military precision, a bucket in the corner. The walls were the color of nothing, not grey, not green, but the shade that institutions choose when they wish to remind you that color is a privilege, not a right. On the cot sat a man whose hands were trembling. These were famous hands. They had composed melodies that soldiers hummed in trenches, that mothers sang to children during air raids, that an entire nation had claimed as its own when the world caught fire, not once, but twice. These hands had moved across ivory keys in the great theatres of the West End, had gestured elegantly from cinema screens in a dozen countries, had signed autographs for queues of women who stretched around city blocks in the rain. Every newspaper in Britain had published photographs of the face above those hands, a face so symmetrical, so absurdly perfect in its proportions, that editors had once declared it the most handsome in all of England. Now those hands shook in a cell in Wormwood Scrubs. His crime was petrol coupons, a handful of them, enough to keep a Rolls-Royce running whilst the rest of Britain queued and rationed and sacrificed. It was wartime, 1944, and outside these walls young men were dying on beaches and in bomber cockpits so that civilization might survive. And here was the matinee idol, the darling of Drury Lane, the man who had written, "Keep the home fires burning," convicted of a peculiarly shabby little fraud that made the newspapers salivate with righteous fury. But this was not really about petrol. If you had asked anyone in the theatre world, anyone at all, from the stagehands to the leading ladies, they would have told you so. They would have looked away first, examined their fingernails or their drink, and then they would have said something careful, something like, "Well, he was never going to get a fair hearing, was he? Not a man like him." And if you pressed them on what they meant by a man like him, they would have changed the subject. Because in 1944, the answer to that question could send you to prison for considerably longer than 8 weeks. The warder processed him like any other inmate. "Name." And he answered, not with the name the world knew, not with the name on theatre marquees from Shaftesbury Avenue to Broadway. He gave the name on his birth certificate, the name his mother had replaced with something grander, borrowed from an Italian soprano she had never met. "Davies," he said. "David Ivor Davies." In here, there were no stage names. In here, the fiction stopped. How does a man arrive at such a night? How does a choir boy from Cardiff become the idol of an empire and then its prisoner? To understand, one must travel back half a century, to a city where the rain falls more often than the sun shines, and where one woman decided that her son would be extraordinary, whatever the cost. Cardiff, in the last decade of the 19th century, was a city that smelled of coal dust and ambition. The docks were among the busiest in the world, funneling Welsh coal to every corner of the British Empire, and the wealth this generated had given the city a grandeur that sat oddly alongside its working-class roots. There were arcades and concert halls, chapels on every corner, and a fierce civic pride that expressed itself most naturally through music. The Welsh sang in churches and in pubs, in parlours, and at Eisteddfodau Fodau, in choirs that competed with the ferocity of football teams. And among the most formidable figures in this musical landscape was a woman named Clara Novello Davies. She was born Clara Davies in 1861, the daughter of ordinary people, but ordinariness was a condition she refused to tolerate. Somewhere in her youth, she had encountered the legend of Clara Anastasia Novello, the great Italian-English soprano who had dazzled audiences across Europe, and she had done something audacious. She had simply taken the name. Not legally, not yet. That would come later, when her son formalized the theft, but socially, professionally, irrevocably. She became Clara Novello Davies, and the borrowed glamour of that surname became the foundation upon which she built everything. And she built a great deal. By the time her son was born, Clara was one of the most celebrated choral conductors in Wales. She led the Royal Welsh Ladies' Choir to international competitions. She taught voice with a discipline that bordered on tyranny. Her husband, David Davies, was a rate collector for the Cardiff City Council. A quiet man, a dutiful man, a man who understood that in the household of Clara Novello Davies there was room for precisely one large personality, and it was not his. He appears in his son's story as a shadow, present but indistinct, a figure glimpsed behind the blaze of his wife's ambition. This absence would echo throughout Ivor's life. The men who mattered to him would always stand in the wings, whilst the women, his mother, his leading ladies, his adoring public, commanded the stage. On the 15th of January, 1893, Clara gave birth to a boy. She named him David Ivor Davies, and from the moment he drew his first breath, she began composing his future. He was not so much raised as rehearsed. Clara taught him to sing before he could properly read. She sat him at the piano when his legs were still too short to reach the pedals. She presented him to guests the way one presents a prized exhibit, proof of her genius, evidence that the Novello name, borrowed though it was, had been earned. "Now then," she would announce, sweeping into the parlour with the boy at her side, "my Ivor will sing for you. Won't you, darling? Show them what you can do." And the boy would sing because he had been taught that singing was not a choice but a duty, and that his mother's approval was the oxygen without which he could not survive. He learned to charm before he learned to feel, and there is a difference, though it can take a lifetime to discover it. The great contralto dame Clara Butt, one of the most celebrated voices in Edwardian England, was among those who recognized the child's gift. According to family recollections, she personally taught young Ivor to sing "Abide with Me," a detail that tells us less about the boy and more about the circles in which his mother moved. Clara Novello Davies did not merely teach music. She collected the famous, the influential, the useful. Her son was both her greatest student and her most effective calling card. At the age of 10, Ivor won a scholarship to Magdalen College School in Oxford, where he joined the chapel choir. It was an exceptional achievement for the son of a Welsh rate collector. It was also a banishment. The boy found himself far from home, far from his mother's overwhelming warmth, among English boys whose accents and assumptions were foreign to him. His voice rang through the ancient chapel with a purity that made choirmasters weep. But outside the choir stalls, he was different. He sensed it without being able to name it, a separateness, a feeling of watching the world from behind glass. The school's organist, one Herbert Brewer, is said to have listened to the boy and delivered a verdict that has since become famous in its wrongness. "You will never make a career in music," he supposedly announced. The story is widely repeated. Though its original source remains uncertain, it may be an embellishment, one of those perfectly shaped anecdotes that accumulate around the famous like barnacles on a ship. But if Brewer did say it, the irony is exquisite. Within a decade, the boy he dismissed would write one of the most recognized songs of the 20th century. Ivor returned to Cardiff. Clara reclaimed him. Private lessons resumed, more intense than before. The boy grew into a youth, and the youth developed two qualities that would define his entire existence: an instinct for melody so natural it seemed to bypass conscious thought, and a face of such startling handsomeness that people who encountered him for the first time often fell silent. It was around this period that the young Welshman discovered operetta, and the discovery was less an appreciation than an obsession. He saw Lehara's Die lustig Witwe, the Merry Widow, 27 times. Not 7, not a dozen, 27. He returned again and again, absorbing the waltzes, the champagne sparkle, the gorgeous deceptions, the way the music made lies feel like truth and truth feel like something rather vulgar. The Merry Widow is, at its heart, a story about disguise, about people pretending to be what they are not in order to protect what they love. The boy from Cardiff did not yet know how completely this theme would govern his own life, but the seed was planted, and it took root in soil that was already prepared. Clara, meanwhile, was sending his early compositions to publishers. The rejection letters arrived with depressing regularity. She filed them and sent out more. Her persistence was not gentle encouragement. It was the relentless forward motion of a woman who had staked her identity on her son's success and would accept no other outcome. What neither Clara nor her son discussed, what no one in Edwardian Britain discussed in polite company, was the shadow that hung over any young man who felt the way Ivor was beginning to feel. In 1895, when the boy was just 2 years old, Oscar Wilde had been sentenced to 2 years hard labour under the Laboucher Amendment for gross indecency. Wilde had entered prison as the most dazzling wit in London and emerged a broken man who died in Parisian exile. His name became a one-word warning. This is what happens if you are caught. Do as you please, but never be discovered. Respectability was not a moral condition. It was a role, and those who played it convincingly could live in relative peace, provided they never dropped their guard. This was the world into which David Ivor Davies was about to step. A world of surfaces and secrets, of applause and concealment. He had been raised by a woman who understood stagecraft better than anyone. He had been given a face that would open every door. He had been denied, by the laws of his country, the right to love as he loved. And he had been taught by Lehara, by Wilder's ghost, by the very air of the age, that the most enduring things in life are often wrapped in the most elaborate pretense. The year was 1914. Europe was about to ignite, and Ivor, though he did not yet bear the Novello surname officially, was 21 years old, unknown, and about to write a song that would make an empire weep. It began, as so many consequential things do, with a commission that seemed routine. Britain was at war. The nation needed rallying. The music halls were hungry for material that could stir the blood and moisten the eye simultaneously, that peculiarly British combination of defiance and sentimentality that functions as emotional armor. Ivor wrote the melody. It came to him quickly. The best ones always did, as if they had been waiting just out of reach and merely needed permission to arrive. For the words, he turned to Lena Gilbert Ford, an American poet living in London, a woman of modest reputation and considerable skill who understood that a lyric, to survive, must be simple enough for a soldier to remember and deep enough for a mother to weep over. Together they produced Keep the Home Fires Burning. The song was not sophisticated. It was earnest, direct, almost naive, and it struck the national nerve with the force of a telegram bearing bad news. Within weeks of its publication, it had become inescapable. Soldiers sang it in trenches knee-deep in mud. Factory workers hummed it over the din of machinery. Mothers sang it to children at bedtime, their voices steady and their eyes bright with unshed tears. It became, without anyone voting on the matter, an unofficial anthem, the song that said what the official anthems could not: that war was terrible, that home was precious, and that the fires of ordinary love were worth more than all the flags and speeches in the world. The young composer awoke one morning to find himself famous. The sensation was not entirely pleasant. Fame brought scrutiny, and scrutiny brought questions. The most pressing was blunt. Why was a healthy 21-year-old man not at the front? He had given the nation a song about courage and sacrifice. Where was his? The answer was complicated. Ivor enlisted in the Royal Naval Air Service, which later merged into the Royal Air Force and served at various air stations. There were 2 flying incidents, the details of which vary between sources. What is clear is that his time in uniform was brief and inglorious. He was discharged, either on medical grounds or following what some biographers have delicately termed a nervous collapse. What is not disputed is the whiff of privilege that clung to his war record. Had strings been pulled? Had the striking young composer been quietly extracted from danger whilst ordinary men marched towards the wire? No evidence proves it, but the suspicion lingered, like smoke after a fire that everyone swears they did not light. It would linger for 30 years, until another war and another accusation of shirking brought it roaring back. That reckoning lay in the future, but the account was open, and the interest was accumulating. Lena Gilbert Ford did not survive the conflict. In 1918, a Gotha bomber raid struck London, and the blast destroyed the building where she lived. The author of a song about keeping the home fires burning was killed by the destruction of her own home. History occasionally arranges its ironies with a precision that would be rejected as too neat in fiction. Ivor grieved. He carried on. He was learning, as all survivors learn, that the world takes what it wants and offers no explanation. He was also learning something more specific, more personal, more dangerous, that he was not like other men, not merely in his talent, not merely in his looks, but in the direction of his desire. London after the armistice was a city simultaneously exhausted and electric. The old certainties had been shattered. Class lines had blurred. Women had entered the workforce. And beneath the surface, a new world was taking shape, faster, louder, more reckless than anything the Edwardians could have imagined. For a young man with a famous song, a jaw that could cut glass, and an instinct for reinvention, it was the perfect moment to arrive. The film industry found him before the theatre did. The new medium of cinema was hungry for faces, and his was remarkable. The camera loved him with an almost indecent enthusiasm. In an era of silent pictures, where the face must do the work that words cannot, his features were a gift, expressive without being theatrical, handsome without being feminine, capable of conveying menace and tenderness in a single close-up. Newspapers began calling him the most handsome man in England, a label he neither sought nor resisted, understanding instinctively that looks, like melody, were a currency best spent whilst they held their value. The films came quickly. The Bohemian Girl in 1922, The Rat in 1925, which made him a genuine star. He played a Parisian Apache, a creature of the underworld, striking and dangerous. And then, in 1927, came Alfred Hitchcock. The Lodger, a story of the London fog, was the film that made Hitchcock's reputation, and it used Novello's good looks as a weapon. He played a mysterious stranger who takes a room in a London boarding house whilst a serial killer stalks the city's streets. The landlady suspects her lodger. The audience suspects him too. But the face, that perfect, symmetrical, almost absurdly lovely face, makes conviction impossible. Surely no one who looks like that could be a murderer. Hitchcock understood what Novello himself had always known, that a radiant exterior is the most effective disguise of all, precisely because people do not wish to see past it. It was during these years of cinematic triumph that the composer dashed off a comic song called "And Her Mother Came Too," written for the performer Jack Buchanan. It was a trifle, a confection, a witty lament about a young man whose romantic escapades are perpetually thwarted by the presence of his beloved's mother. It was also one of the few genuinely light-hearted things he ever produced, a brief flash of levity in a career that would become increasingly devoted to grand romantic gestures and sweeping orchestral passion. The coming of sound nearly finished him. His voice, pleasant enough warm, with a Welsh lilt he could never entirely suppress, was not the instrument his face was. Hollywood beckoned. He went. He returned. The official explanation was homesickness. The more probable reason was something else entirely. "You've got a face worth $1 million, Mr. Novello." One can imagine a studio executive drawling across a mahogany desk. But that accent, and Ivor would have smiled, that practiced, deflecting smile, because he had learned long ago to smile when people said uncomfortable things. But the real issue was not his accent. In Hollywood, the studio system governed every aspect of a star's existence, whom they were seen with, where they dined, who shared their bed. For a man whose private arrangements required absolute discretion, the fishbowl of the American film colony was not an opportunity. It was a trap. He came back to London. He came back to the stage. And he came back to the one person who had been waiting with a patience that asked for nothing and offered everything. But before we reach that person, that quiet, steady, indispensable presence, there is another figure who demands attention, a rival, a mirror, a fellow traveller on the same dangerous road. Noel Coward was everything Ivor Novello was not. Where Novello was warm, Coward was glacial. Where Novello charmed, Coward cut. Where Novello drew people close, Coward held them at arm's length with a quip so perfectly aimed that they were left laughing at their own exclusion. Both men were homosexual. Both understood that their survival depended on a constant act of concealment, not the kind that happened on stage, but the kind that happened every waking moment of every public day. They had arrived at different strategies for the same predicament. Coward cultivated the persona of the eccentric bachelor, so brittle and so brilliant that no one dared look too closely. Novello cultivated warmth, generosity, an open door and a full table, trusting that affection would serve as a better shield than wit. They were friends. They were competitors. They understood each other in the way that only people who share a dangerous secret can. In 1927, Coward's play Sirocco opened in London and collapsed within weeks, a humiliating public failure that left its author badly shaken. Novello had nothing to do with the production, but the timing was pointed. In that very same period, the Welshman was riding the crest of his fame, luminous and seemingly untouchable. The contrast strung. Coward later wrote of Novello, in words that have been widely quoted, though their precise original source remains elusive, that he suddenly realized how far I still had to go to enter that magical atmosphere in which he moved with such effortless grace. It was a generous remark. It was also, perhaps, a calculated one. Coward was never generous without purpose. But beneath the polish, something genuine flickered, the recognition that they were two conjurers on the same stage, each knowing the other's trick and neither willing to give the game away. Cecil Beaton, that indefatigable chronicler of glamour and gossip, coined a phrase for their world, the Ivor Novello naughty set. It was said with a smirk, but it carried a blade. Naughty was the word polite society used when it meant something far more serious, something that the law defined not as mischief, but as crime. Now we come to Bobby. Somewhere in the winter of 1916, or perhaps it was early 1917, the precise date has not survived, if it was ever recorded. Ivor Novello met a young actor and playwright named Robert Andrews. Bobby, as everyone called him, was 21 or 22 years old. He was not a star. He was not, by the standards of the West End, particularly remarkable. He acted. He wrote plays, sketches, screenplays, the serviceable work that keeps a man employed without making him famous. He had a pleasant face, an easy manner, and a quality that is difficult to define but impossible to mistake. He was calm. In a world of spotlights and ovations, of curtain calls and newspaper columns, Bobby Andrews was the sound of a door closing softly behind you at the end of a long day. He was the chair by the fire. He was the cup of tea that someone has made without being asked. They found each other in the theatrical world of wartime London, a world of blackout curtains and crowded dressing rooms, of shows that went on despite the distant rumble of guns across the channel. How they met, precisely, is lost. No memoir records the moment. No diary entry preserves the first glance, the first conversation, the first recognition of something shared. What is known is that from that meeting onward, for 35 years, until death intervened, they were inseparable. One must pause here to consider what that meant. Not in the abstract, not as a matter of historical interest or social commentary, but in the grinding, daily, practical reality of two men who loved each other in a country where that love was a criminal offence. They lived together. The flat above the Strand Theatre, that remarkable arrangement, a home perched directly above a stage, as if the boundary between life and illusion had been erased by architecture, became their shared domain. To the outside world they were companions, friends, colleagues. The words the English language provides for such arrangements are carefully vague, designed to describe everything and reveal nothing. When journalists visited, there were separate bedrooms to be shown. When photographers came, the composition of every image was considered. No gesture that might be misread, no glance that lingered a moment too long, a vigilance not of wartime which has an end, but of a life sentence served in plain sight. "Tea's going cold," Bobby would say, and from behind the closed door of the music room would come the reply. One moment, two more bars, the clink of a teaspoon, the murmur of a melody finding its shape. The small domestic sounds of a love that dared not raise its voice. The flat above the Strand was their weekday life. For weekends, there was reed roofs. Ivor purchased the country house in 1927 in Littlewick Green, Berkshire, close enough to London to reach by motor car, far enough to breathe. Here, away from the press, the composer allowed himself freedoms that Shaftesbury Avenue could not accommodate. The weekend parties at reed roofs became legendary in theatrical circles, and legendary is a word that, in this context, carries a specific charge. The gatherings were extravagant, flamboyant, and by the letter of the law, profoundly illegal. There was an evening, recounted in several memoirs with the vagueness that signals shared guilt, when a car was heard on the gravel drive at an unexpected hour. The music stopped. Conversations died mid-sentence. Someone moved to the window. It was only a neighbor, lost and turning round. But for a frozen moment, every person in that drawing room had felt the same thing, the cold hand of consequence reaching through the curtains of their carefully constructed freedom. The police knew about reed roofs. They always knew. But the house was private, and its owner was useful, and the British establishment had long since perfected the art of tolerating in private what it condemned in public. The arrangement held. For now. There was also Jamaica. Ivor bought a house on the island, a retreat within a retreat, a place where two men could sit on a veranda in the evening warmth without calculating who might be watching. The Caribbean was not England. The weight of English law felt lighter there, the scrutiny less relentless, the air itself less freighted with judgment. They went when they could. They returned when they must. But there were others, briefly. Around 1923, Ivor had a short affair with Siegfried Sassoon, the war poet, the decorated soldier, the man who had written some of the most devastating verses ever produced about the futility of combat. The liaison was confirmed decades later by Sassoon's biographer, John Stewart Roberts, and reported in The Guardian. The pairing was improbable, and perhaps that was the point. Sassoon was a man broken open by what he had witnessed. The mud, the wire, the friends who went over the top and did not come back. His poetry was a scalpel applied to the flesh of patriotism. Novello, by contrast, spun waltzes and romances, giving audiences permission to feel lovely things in a world that was not lovely at all. They were opposite responses to the same wound. Sassoon fled from reality into truth. Novello fled from reality into fantasy. When they met, it was a collision of two escapes, brief, intense, unsustainable. "You write about what frightens you," Novello might have said, and perhaps did in some version on some evening now lost. "I write about what I want. In the end, we're both lying." It is the kind of remark that sounds like him, self-aware, lightly delivered, with a blade hidden inside the charm. The affair ended. Sassoon would later marry a woman, Hester Gatty, in 1933, in what appears to have been a conventional arrangement that society expected and the heart endured. Novello returned to Bobby. He always returned to Bobby. Different strategies, different armor, but the same cage, its bars forged from the same unyielding statute. One might ask, and people did ask, in the careful, coded language of the time, whether Bobby minded. Whether the quiet man who made the tea and waited in the wings resented sharing Ivor with a war poet, or with the nameless others who drifted through the parties at reed roofs, or with the millions of strangers who claimed the right to adore a man they had never met? The answer, so far as anyone could tell, was no. Bobby Andrews was not a jealous man. He was a patient one. He understood something that jealous people never grasp, that a heart is not a finite resource, and that a man who needs the love of multitudes is not thereby incapable of loving one person absolutely. Bobby was the constant. The rest was weather, but the weather could be lethal. The law that had destroyed Oscar Wilde had not softened in the intervening decades. If anything, enforcement had tightened. Blackmail was epidemic. A young man with a grudge, a servant with a grievance, a stranger who turned out to be a plainclothes officer, any of these could end a career, a reputation, a life. Men were prosecuted. Men were imprisoned. Men took their own lives rather than face trial. This was the ambient terror of homosexual existence in Britain, as constant and as invisible as the hum of electricity in the walls. Novello navigated this landscape with the tools his mother had given him: charm, generosity, the instinct to please. He made himself indispensable to people who might otherwise have been dangerous. A man who entertains the nation is afforded certain protections, not by law but by custom, and the Welshman understood this bargain intuitively. As long as the melodies kept coming and the theatres kept filling, the establishment would look the other way. The 1930s brought a transformation that would define the second half of his career. The cinema that had made him famous was becoming a medium he could no longer command. Sound had changed the rules. His face, once sufficient, now required a voice to match, and the screen, which had adored him so extravagantly, began to cool. He needed a new arena. He found one. The Theatre Royal, Drury Lane, is not merely a building. It is an idea, the idea that theatre matters, that it occupies a central place in the life of a nation, that what happens beneath its roof is not diversion, but ritual. To command Drury Lane is to command something close to the soul of British drama. And in 1935, Ivor Novello took command. Glamorous Night opened that year, and he did everything. Composed the score, wrote the book, played the leading man. Total authorship, total control. It was the work of a man who had spent 2 decades learning every facet of his craft and was now deploying them simultaneously, a one-man empire of melody and spectacle. Careless Rapture followed in 36, Crest of the Wave in 37, 3 triumphs in 3 years. Drury Lane became, in everything but legal title, his kingdom. The critics sharpened their pencils. Too sweet, they said, too ornamental, but the houses were full, every night, for years. The public did not care what the critics thought. The public wanted to feel something, and this man, aging now, approaching his mid-40s, but still possessed of that arresting profile, gave them permission to feel it. Then, in the spring of 1939, as the continent lurched towards catastrophe, Novello premiered his masterwork. The Dancing Years opened at Drury Lane on the 23rd of March, and its timing was either miraculous or cursed, perhaps both. The story was set in Vienna across 3 decades, from the gilded twilight of the Habsburgs through the rise of National Socialism. Its hero was a composer, a man very like its author. Its theme was love tested by politics, by prejudice, by time itself. Its audience, sitting in a London theatre 6 months before the invasion of Poland, recognized in this fictional Vienna a mirror of their own world. a civilization that believed itself eternal, discovering too late that it was not. The house wept. Not politely, not discreetly, but with the collective emotional release that only live theatre can produce. They wept because the story was exquisite, and because the exquisite, in the spring of 1939, felt like something about to be taken away. 6 months later, it was. Drury Lane was requisitioned for the war effort. The dancing years transferred to the Adelphi Theatre, where it ran for nearly 700 performances in total. Night after night, whilst the Luftwaffe tried to burn London to the ground. There were evenings when the bombs fell close enough to shake the walls. The orchestra played on. The cast sang on. The audience stayed. The theatre was a refuge, not from the blast, which the walls would not have stopped, but from the dread. Novello was 46 when the war began, too old for conscription. He worked without pause concerts for the troops, charity galas, broadcasts. Keep the Home Fires Burning, the song he had written as a young man in a previous conflict, found its way back into the national repertoire. A quarter of a century had passed. A new generation of soldiers was singing the same words. The melody had not aged. The composer had. And then, in 1943, Clara died. She was 82. She had watched her son's ascent from the front row of every premiere, had basked in his reflected glory whilst simultaneously believing, perhaps correctly, that the glory was hers to begin with. She was the architect. He was the edifice. Without her blueprints, he would have been David Davies from Cardiff, a pleasant young man with a knack for a tune. She had given him the name, the ambition, the discipline, the unshakable conviction that he was destined for greatness. She had also given him something less welcome, a dependence on approval so deep that it functioned as an addiction, a hunger to be admired that no amount of admiration could satisfy. Her death left him unmoored. For the first time in 50 years, the woman who had guided and goaded and driven him was gone. The grief was real. But so beneath it, unspoken, shameful, impossible to admit, was a strange lightness. The iron hand had released its grip. He could breathe. He could stumble. Bobby was there. Bobby was always there, but Bobby was not Clara. Bobby did not command, did not direct, did not push. Bobby simply loved. And Ivor was not certain he knew how to exist without a hand at his back, steering him forward. Within a year of his mother's death, he would make the worst mistake of his life. Whether Clara's absence removed a restraint that had kept him safe is a question biography can pose but never answer. What is certain is that the son, unmoored from the mother, drifted towards the rocks, and the rocks were waiting. The woman's name was Dora Constable. She was not famous, not wealthy, not remarkable in any way that the historical record has preserved. She was a fan, and that word, derived from fanatic, contains within it a spectrum that runs from harmless enthusiasm to something darker, more obsessive, more willing to cross lines that ought not to be crossed. Dora occupied the further end of that spectrum, though she would not have recognized the description. She simply adored Ivor Novello. She would have done anything for him, and that, precisely, was the problem. Dora worked for a firm that had access to supplementary petrol coupons, the ration books that controlled fuel distribution during wartime. Every gallon was accounted for. Every coupon represented not merely fuel but fairness. The national compact that said we are all in this together, that no one takes more than their share, that sacrifice is distributed equally from the docks of Liverpool to the drawing rooms of Mayfair. The system was imperfect, riddled with small cheats and quiet fiddles, but its principle was sacred. To violate it was not merely illegal. It was, in the moral vocabulary of wartime Britain, betrayal. Dora stole the coupons from her employer. She gave them to Novello. He used them to fuel his Rolls-Royce. One must sit with this for a moment. A Rolls-Royce in wartime. Whilst soldiers crossed the channel in landing craft and pilots burned alive in cockpits, the darling of the West End was topping up the tank of his Rolls-Royce with stolen coupons provided by a besotted admirer. The optics, as a modern publicist would say, were catastrophic. But Novello did not think in terms of optics. He thought in terms of the world as he experienced it, a world of stage doors and first nights, of weekends at reed roofs and holidays in Jamaica, a world in which a Rolls-Royce was not an extravagance but a fixture, as natural and as necessary as the piano in his drawing room. Why did he accept? The question admits several answers, each nested inside the next. The first and most obvious, carelessness. He was a man accustomed to privilege. Privilege dulls the moral sense. When one has always had enough, the concept of rationing feels abstract, a rule designed for other people. He did not think, he simply took. The second, deeper, he could not refuse a woman who worshipped him. This was Clara's legacy, the mother who had taught him that adoration was oxygen, that to be loved was to exist, that to reject devotion in any form was to risk annihilation. Dora offered him something. To turn it away would have been to reject her, and rejection was foreign to his nature. He collected admirers the way other men collected stamps, compulsively, unable to discard even the ones that might prove dangerous. The third, deepest of all, the Rolls-Royce, the country house, the lovely objects that filled his life. These were the only territories he truly controlled. His talent belonged to the public. His body belonged to the law, which could criminalize its desires at any moment. His name belonged to his mother's ambition. But the car was his. The leather seats, the walnut dashboard, the purr of the engine as it carried him down country lanes towards reed roofs, towards Bobby, towards the only version of freedom he had ever known. To surrender it would have been to acknowledge that the world was closing in, and he was not ready for that. Not yet, Bobby knew. One can picture the moment, the coupons on a table, Dora's name mentioned too casually, and the alarm in Bobby's voice. Ivor, this is madness. Give them back. Oh, come now. Who's going to care about a few coupons? Bobby's reply, soft but precise, carrying the weight of a man who has spent decades watching the person he loves dance along the edge of a precipice. Everyone, Ivor, everyone will care. But Bobby was not Clara. Bobby did not command. Bobby advised, and advice, unlike commands, can be ignored. The authorities discovered the fraud. A tip-off, an investigation, the sort of bureaucratic machinery that grinds without passion and produces results without mercy. Novello was charged. The case came to Bow Street Magistrates' Court in April of 1944. The trial was brief. The evidence was clear. The defense was weak. The sentence, 8 weeks imprisonment. Wormwood Scrubs. In theatrical circles, a rumour circulated and circulates still that the magistrate harboured a particular dislike for musical theatre and for the sort of men who made it. No documentary evidence supports this claim. It belongs to the category of things said in dressing rooms and at after-show suppers, repeated with conviction and never verified. But the truth it gestures towards is real enough. regardless of whether this particular magistrate embodied it. A homosexual man standing before a British court in 1944 was vulnerable in ways that the charge sheet did not enumerate. The bench did not need to know what the West End knew. It was enough that a whiff of something irregular hung about the defendant, a certain flamboyance, a certain absence of a wife, and that the law, which could not reach him for the greater offence, had found a lesser one that would serve. The newspapers devoured it. Here was the man who had written the song about keeping fires burning, caught fiddling his petrol rations whilst the nation burned. The irony wrote itself. The headline writers did not need to be clever. They only needed to be cruel, and cruelty came naturally to a press that had spent years treating Novello as public property and now felt entitled to a public reckoning. And then the iron door closed. We returned to the cell. Not as we first encountered it, in ignorance, seeing only the trembling hands and the carbolic walls, but with full knowledge of the man who sat there. We know now about Clara and the borrowed name, about Bobby and the flat above the theatre, about the song and the war and the Rolls-Royce. We know about Reed roofs and the law that made love a felony. We know about the face that launched 1,000 matinees and the voice that could not quite conquer Hollywood. We know all of this, and so the cell is no longer merely a cell. It is the place where everything converges. Every compromise, every act, every careful lie, and every reckless truth, they all lead here to this cot, this bucket, this bulb caged in wire. He served approximately 4 weeks. Good behavior earned early release. What happened during those weeks, no one knows. He never spoke of it. Not to journalists, not to biographers, not, so far as the record shows, to Bobby. The absence of testimony is perhaps the most eloquent testimony of all. What Novello experienced in that place was so fundamentally incompatible with the identity he had constructed, the glamour, the grace, the effortless charm, that to speak of it would have been to admit that the identity was, and had always been, a construction. And that admission would have brought down everything. 3 things are known, not from his words, but from the observable consequences. His health declined. The chest pains that would eventually kill him began around this time or shortly after. Whether the stress of imprisonment triggered an underlying cardiac condition, no physician recorded. But the body keeps its own accounts, and the heart, that most literal and most metaphorical of organs, does not forget what the mind refuses to acknowledge. His spirit fractured. Not visibly, the facade held, as it always held, but those who knew him well saw something altered in his gaze afterwards. A wariness, a flinch. The look of a man who has discovered that the world contains a room he had never imagined and cannot quite stop imagining. Bobby came to visit. He came as often as regulations permitted, sat across a table in a room designed to strip all intimacy from the act of meeting, and did what he had always done. He showed up. In a room where a warder listened to every syllable, where the table between them stretched like an ocean, where the simple act of reaching out to touch the hand of the person you love was impossible. In that room, Bobby Andrews placed his palms on the table, facing upward. Ivor placed his own hands down, inches away. They did not touch. They did not need to. After 27 years, some things are communicated through proximity alone, through the stubborn, unspectacular miracle of still being there. He was released. He returned to the dancing years. The audience at the Adelphi that evening knew he was coming back. Word had spread through the theatrical grapevine, through the newspapers, through the devoted network that connected his admirers across the country. The house was packed. When he walked on stage, there was a moment of held breath, and then the applause began. It did not stop for several minutes. The cast stood still. The orchestra lowered their instruments. The audience rose, not in sections, not gradually, but all at once, as if lifted by a single impulse. They clapped and wept and called his name, and in that sound was everything: forgiveness and love and relief, and the fierce, protective anger of people who believed that one of their own had been treated too harshly. Whether he had been treated too harshly is debatable. The law was the law, and he had broken it. But the audience was not interested in the law. They were interested in the man. He was back. That was enough. He stood in the light and let it wash over him. He smiled. He bowed. And then the show went on. But something was broken that no ovation could mend. He carried the weight of those 4 weeks for the rest of his life, buried beneath layers of work and charm and music, never acknowledged, never examined, never healed. He had added a final stratum to the edifice of concealment that had been under construction since boyhood, concealment of his mother's control, of his desires, of the law's power over him, and now of the punishment that had confirmed, in the most brutal terms, that the world he inhabited was made of glass. The months that followed were quiet. The summer and autumn of 1944 passed in a kind of convalescence, not physical rest, precisely, because rest was something the Welshman had never mastered, but a slow, private reassembly of the self. He worked because work was the only medicine he trusted. He planned because planning meant the future still existed. And he wrote. The war ended. Europe exhaled. Britain, victorious and exhausted, turned to the work of rebuilding, not just the bombed cities and the shattered infrastructure, but the national spirit, which had been stretched to its limit and now sagged like canvas with too few poles. People wanted escape. They wanted, after 6 years of rationing and blackouts and telegrams from the War Office, to sit in a theatre and feel something that was not grief. Novello gave them exactly that. Perchance to Dream opened in 1945, and it was, by every commercial measure, the greatest triumph of his career. 1,022 performances. The story spanned 3 generations: love, loss, the persistence of hope. It was lush and romantic and unapologetically sentimental, and the audiences who flocked to it did not care what the critics thought, because the critics had not spent 5 years sleeping in Anderson shelters. The show contained a song that would outlast everything else the composer ever wrote, outlast the musicals, the films, the fame, the scandal, the man himself. We'll Gather Lilacs was a ballad of longing and reunion, a promise made to someone absent, a declaration that the separation would end and the garden would bloom again. The melody was simple, the great ones always are, and the lyric was direct in a way that his more elaborate compositions sometimes were not. We'll gather lilacs in the spring again and walk together down an English lane. That was all. That was enough. Lilac. The flower that blooms briefly and brilliantly in May, filling the air with a fragrance so intense it seems almost aggressive, as if the plant knows it has only a few weeks and is determined to make them count. The most intoxicating scent of spring, and the most transient. Novello could not have known, or perhaps he sensed, in the way that artists sometimes sense things their conscious minds have not yet grasped, that this flower would become his emblem, his memorial, the last word on his grave. He worked with the ferocity of a man outrunning something. 14-hour days. Writing, rehearsing, staging, managing. Bobby watched and worried. "You need to rest, Ivor." "I need to work." A pause, Bobby, choosing his words the way he always did, gently, without force. "It's the same thing with you. You only rest when you're working." And then, more softly, a confession dressed as a joke. "And you only rest when I'm working." Bobby smiled. He knew it was true. He had always known. The heart was sending warnings. Shortness of breath on the stairs. A tightness across the chest that arrived without announcement, lingered for minutes, then retreated. A visitor testing the locks, deciding whether to force the door. He ignored it. To acknowledge it would have been to stop, and to stop would have been to sit with the quiet. And in the quiet, the walls of a prison cell might close in again, and the mother who was gone might start speaking, and the love that had no name might demand one. Better to fill every hour with music and motion and the roar of the stalls. In 1949, he premiered King's Rhapsody. And if ever a man wrote his own epitaph without knowing it, this was the moment. The story concerned a monarch in exile, a king who has renounced his throne for love and lives abroad in comfortable obscurity, only to be summoned back to his country, where duty demands that he sacrifice his private happiness for the sake of his people. Ruritanian romance of the purest kind, complete with uniforms and waltzes and a love triangle that resolved itself in noble renunciation. The critics, predictably, found it old-fashioned. The public, equally predictably, adored it. 841 performances. The production was still running, still filling the house, on the night that mattered most. The autobiographical echoes were transparent. A man who has built a life in one place, summoned to play a role not of his choosing. A man who sacrifices private love for public duty. A man who wears a crown that is also a chain. Novello had been writing about himself for decades. All his heroes were idealized reflections, transposed into settings where a man could love freely and suffer gracefully and be redeemed by melody. But King's Rhapsody cut closer than the others. Its hero was not young. He was weary. He sensed that the act could not last forever, and that when it ended, there would be nothing left but the stillness he had spent his entire life fleeing. For 22 months he played that king. Every evening he climbed into the costume, applied the grease paint, walked onto the stage, and became a man who gave up everything for obligation. Every evening the audience watched and wept and applauded. And every evening, when the final curtain fell, he climbed the stairs to the flat above the theatre, to Bobby and the tea and the quiet, and to a tightness in his chest that was no longer retreating. On the 22nd month, it decided to stay. The 5th of March, 1951, was a Wednesday. There was nothing remarkable about it. The weather was cold. Early March in London is always cold, that damp grey chill that settles into the bones and makes spring feel like a rumour. The newspapers carried their usual freight of politics and sport and minor scandal. The war had been over for nearly 6 years, but the country still bore its scars, bomb sites colonized by weeds, rationing not yet fully lifted, a greyness in the national fabric that victory had not quite managed to wash out. In the flat above the Strand Theatre, Ivor Novello woke beside the man who had shared his life for 35 years. Bobby made tea, as he had every morning for 3 decades. Not routine ritual. The kettle, the pot, the cups, the particular way he knew Ivor took his. These were the liturgy of a love that the world refused to name. They read the newspapers. They discussed the evening's performance. King's Rhapsody was in its 22nd month, and the mechanisms of a long-running show had settled into a groove, not complacency, but the particular confidence that comes from having done a thing so many times that the body remembers what the mind no longer needs to direct. He said he felt well enough that morning. Whether this was true or merely one more act in a lifetime of acts, even Bobby could not be certain. The composer had spent 58 years appearing to be what he was not, younger, healthier, happier than the facts warranted, and by now the habit was so seamless that the line between truth and display had worn away entirely. The tightness in the chest was it worse today. He did not mention it. He never mentioned it. Complaining was a form of honesty, and honesty was a luxury he had never been able to afford. The afternoon passed. He sat at the piano, working on revisions. Bobby moved quietly through the flat, attending to letters and telephone calls, the invisible labor of managing a famous man's existence. They inhabited the same rooms with the ease of long practice, two planets in a settled orbit, each aware of the other's position without needing to look. Evening came. The Strand Theatre, their downstairs neighbour, their livelihood, their world, began its nightly transformation. House lights warmed. Ushers took their positions. The audience filed in, shedding coats and umbrellas, finding seats, opening programs. Below the flat, separated by a floor and a ceiling and the thin membrane between private life and public spectacle, the machinery of theatre hummed into readiness. Novello descended. He entered the dressing room. The grease paint went on, the ritual application that transformed David Ivor Davies, a tired Welshman of 58 with a faltering heart and a secret, into a Ruritanian king in exile, magnificent and doomed. The costume followed. The mirror reflected back a version of himself that was not quite himself and not quite anyone else, the liminal creature that every actor becomes in the minutes before a curtain rises. He walked on stage. The audience received him as they always did, with a warmth that was not merely appreciation, but something closer to devotion. These were his people, the ones who had followed him from Drury Lane to the Adelphi to the Strand, who had queued in rain and blackout, who had brought their mothers and their daughters and returned. He performed. He sang. He moved through the choreography and the emotional architecture of a story he had written about a man very like himself. Nothing, according to those who were present, suggested that this evening was different from the 800 that had preceded it. The voice was steady. The timing was precise. The charm was intact. If the exiled king seemed wearier than usual, well, the king was supposed to be weary. That was the point of the role. The final curtain came down. Applause swelled and subsided. The house lights rose. The audience dispersed into the cold March night, pulling on coats, hailing taxis, returning to lives that had been briefly illuminated by someone else's invention. They did not know, could not have known, that they were the last audience Ivor Novello would ever have. He climbed the stairs. Those stairs, connecting the theatre to the flat, the public self to the private one, the act to the person. He had climbed them thousands of times. Tonight they seemed steeper. But he reached the top, and Bobby was there, and the door closed behind him. Friends came by, a small gathering after the show, as was sometimes the custom. There was conversation, laughter, the easy camaraderie of theatre people unwinding after a performance. The Welshman was animated, charming, present. He spoke of future plans. He told stories. He was by all accounts entirely himself, which is to say, entirely the version of himself that he allowed others to see. And then the pain came, not the familiar tightness, not the breathlessness that arrived and retreated. This was different, a fist closing around his heart with a grip that did not relent. He gasped. The colour left his face. The room, which had been full of warmth and laughter, went cold. A doctor was summoned. In those days, before paramedics and cardiac units and the apparatus of modern emergency medicine, a doctor was summoned, and one waited, and the waiting was a kind of prayer. It was not enough. The coronary thrombosis, the clot that blocked the artery that fed the muscle that pumped the blood that sustained the life, was massive and irreversible. The heart that had carried him through 58 years of concealment and creation, through 2 world wars and 1,000 opening nights, through the adoration of millions and the love of one, that heart, overtaxed and under-acknowledged, simply stopped. Ivor Novello died in the early hours of the 6th of March, 1951. He was in the flat above the theatre. Bobby was beside him. Somewhere below, in the empty auditorium, a night watchman was making his rounds, torch in hand, moving between rows of vacant seats, checking doors, performing the small custodial duties that keep a theatre safe when the theatre is dark. Click. Click, click. One by one, the remaining lights went out. The stage was bare. The orchestra pit was silent. The great velvet curtain hung motionless, a wall between the space where stories were told and the space where they were not. Upstairs, in the flat that had been both sanctuary and hiding place, both home and prison, the same darkness gathered. The news broke with the morning papers. London woke to headlines that carried, for once, no ambiguity, only the blunt fact of loss. The most celebrated entertainer of his generation was gone. At 58, without warning, between one heartbeat and the absence of the next. The grief was immediate and, by the standards of British Reserve, extravagant. Flowers accumulated outside the Strand Theatre, first a few bouquets, then a tide of them, roses and carnations, and inevitably lilac. The cremation took place at Golders Green Crematorium in North London, the same chapel that had received the remains of Rudyard Kipling and Sigmund Freud, a place accustomed to the illustrious dead. His ashes were placed beneath a lilac bush. A plaque was set into the ground, and on it were inscribed 5 words from King's Rhapsody, the show he had been performing when his heart failed. The words were, "Till you are home once more." The song about gathering lilacs had promised a reunion. The plaque acknowledged that the reunion had not arrived. The conditional tense, "till," held the door open. Someday, not yet, but someday. 2 mourners stood apart from the others as the service ended. One leaned towards the second and murmured, "That man, Andrews, what was he to him exactly?" And the reply, equally low, "A friend, an old friend." A pause. "Ah, I see." 3 syllables that contained a universe of understanding and a universe of erasure, delivered simultaneously, as only the English can manage. Bobby Andrews was 56 years old. He had been the most important person in Ivor Novello's life for 35 years, and he was, in the eyes of the law, in the eyes of the press, in the eyes of everyone who had not been paying close attention, nobody in particular, a companion, the vague, polite, carefully empty word that the world had always used. He was not a widower because there had been no marriage. He was not a partner because that term, in its modern sense, had not yet been coined. He was not mentioned in the obituaries except in passing, a name among names, unremarkable. He would live for another 25 years, a quarter of a century without the man who had been the center of his existence. He died in 1976, quietly, in the way that people die when the world has long since stopped watching. What he did during those years, how he filled them, whether he found any measure of peace or simply endured, the record does not say. Bobby Andrews was never the story. He was the person who stood behind it, holding it upright, and when it ended, he was left holding air. The estate was valued at approximately £160,000, a sum equivalent to 4 or 5 million in today's currency, testament to decades of sold-out houses and shrewd management. But the truest legacy was not financial. King's Rhapsody continued to run after its creator's death, the role recast, the machinery grinding forward without its engine. It was a surreal spectacle, a production written by a man about a man very like himself, staged nightly in the building where he had lived and died, with someone else wearing his costumes and singing his songs. The theatre did not pause. The theatre never pauses. The curtain rises because it must, because there are tickets sold and salaries owed, and the dead, however beloved, cannot hold it down. Gradually the show closed. The audience drifted away. The world that Novello had constructed, that glittering, improbable domain of Ruritanian princes and Viennese waltzes, began to recede like a tide going out. New sounds were stirring. Rock and roll crackled from American dance halls. In London, a generation of angry young playwrights, Osborne, Pinter, Wesker, were sharpening their pens. The drawing-room elegance that Novello and Coward had perfected suddenly looked not charming, but absurd, a relic of a world the war had shattered, and the post-war generation had no interest in rebuilding. His musicals vanished from the repertoire with a speed that would have astonished their creator. They were not revived. They were not recorded, except in fragments. They existed in the memories of those who had seen them and nowhere else, and as those memories aged and faded, the works faded with them. This is the peculiar fate of theatrical art. It lives only in the moment of its staging, and when the performer is gone, the act is gone, and what remains is a script, a score, a set of instructions for an experience that can never be precisely replicated. Coward survived. His plays, sharp, witty, built on language rather than spectacle, proved more durable. Private Lives and Blithe Spirit entered the canon. They could be performed by anyone in any era because their essence was verbal, not dependent on the physical presence of their creator. Novello's essence was himself. His face, his voice, his magnetic pull on stage, these were not transferable. Without him, the shows were technically competent but spiritually vacant, like a cathedral after the congregation has departed. And yet the name endured, attached to things he never knew. In 1956, the British music industry established the Ivor Novello Awards, honoring excellence in songwriting and composition. The roll call of recipients reads like a history of popular song. Lennon and McCartney, Elton John, David Bowie, Adele. Every year his name is spoken from a podium. How many of those laureates know who he was? How many could name a single song he wrote? The name survives. The person behind it has become a ghost. In 2005, the Strand Theatre was renamed. It became the Novello Theatre, a belated tribute, more than half a century after his death, to the man who had lived above its stage and died above its auditorium. Today, audiences enter the building to see whatever production is currently running and sit in seats that were there when he was there. They breathe air that circulates through rooms where he composed, where he argued with directors, where he embraced Bobby Andrews when the door was locked and the curtains were drawn. They do not know this. Buildings keep their secrets as faithfully as the people who inhabited them. The most famous man of his age became one of the least remembered figures of the next. His contemporaries, Coward, Hitchcock, the war poets, remained vivid in the cultural memory. Novello faded. His art was bound to his presence, and without that presence it had no engine. He left no memoir, no autobiography, no confessional interview, no revelatory diary. The facade he maintained in life, he maintained into death. There was nothing for biographers to seize upon. He had mastered the art of being fascinating whilst revealing nothing, and when the fascination dimmed, the nothing was all that remained. And there was a crueler factor still. His homosexuality, which had been his greatest vulnerability whilst he lived, became his greatest irrelevance when he died. When the Sexual Offences Act of 1967 partially decriminalised homosexual acts in England and Wales, the stories that emerged were stories of defiance, of activism, of pride. Novello's story was none of these. His was a story of survival through silence, of a life lived entirely within the rules of a system he never challenged. He was not a rebel. He was not a martyr. He was a man who kept his head down and his smile bright and hoped the world would leave him alone. In an age that celebrates those who fought, the memory of those who merely endured grows dim. 1 year after Novello died, the system that had shaped his life claimed another victim, and this time the world would eventually notice. Alan Turing was a mathematician. He was also, by any reasonable measure, one of the people most responsible for the Allied victory in the Second World War. His work at Bletchley Park, cracking the Enigma code, had shortened the conflict by years and saved countless lives. He was a genius in the most precise sense, a mind that operated on a plane inaccessible to ordinary intelligence, seeing patterns where others saw chaos, building machines that prefigured the digital revolution. In 1952, Turing was arrested for gross indecency. His crime was the same as Wilder's, the same unspoken crime that had shadowed Novello's existence. The prosecution offered a choice: prison or chemical castration. He chose the hormones. They were injected into his body over the course of a year, altering his chemistry, breaking him down from the inside with the methodical cruelty of a state that viewed his desire as a disease. On the 7th of June, 1954, Alan Turing was found dead in his home. A half-eaten apple lay beside his bed. The inquest ruled suicide, though the circumstances remain debated to this day. He was 41 years old. The same law, the same country, the same implacable machinery of moral enforcement that had sent Wilder to Reading Jail and Novello to Wormwood Scrubs. The Laboucher Amendment did not discriminate between the celebrated and the obscure, between the code breaker and the composer of waltzes. It consumed them all with equal appetite. Novello, one might say, was fortunate, if the word can be applied to a man who died at 58 with a broken heart in every sense. He died before the system could reach him for the offence it truly wished to punish. His conviction was for petrol fraud, not for the greater crime he committed every evening in the flat above the theatre. Had he lived another decade, would the knock have come? Would a plainclothes officer have appeared at his door as one appeared at Turing's, with questions that admitted only incriminating answers? There is no way to know, but the possibility had always been there, a shadow at the edge of the spotlight, patient and cold. 13 years after Turing's death, Parliament acted. The Sexual Offences Act of 1967 decriminalised homosexual acts between consenting adults over the age of 21 in England and Wales, a partial, grudging reform that nonetheless represented the first fracture in a wall that had stood since 1885. Scotland followed in 1980, Northern Ireland in 1982. The age of consent was not equalized until 2000. The journey from crime to something approaching acceptance was not a march but a crawl, and it is not finished yet. In 2013, Alan Turing received a posthumous royal pardon. 4 years later, the provision informally known as the Turing Act extended the same grace to an estimated 49,000 men convicted of consensual homosexual acts that would no longer constitute offences. 49,000. The number is abstract until you pause to consider that each unit represents a life, a career wrecked, a family fractured, a man who went to bed each night knowing that the person he was, at the most fundamental level, was illegal. Novello's name does not appear on that list. He was not convicted under the Laboucher Amendment. His crime, on paper, was petrol fraud. The law touched him sideways, through a pretext rather than a direct blow. But the spirit of the Turing pardon, the belated acknowledgement that the state had no business in the bedrooms of its citizens, that love is not an offence, that the suffering inflicted on generations of men was not justice but persecution, that spirit encompasses him too. It encompasses every man who lived as he lived, carefully, behind a locked door, one eye always on the window, one ear tuned to the sound of footsteps on the stair. We cannot know what Ivor Novello would have been if the world had let him be himself. This is the cruelest dimension of historical injustice. It does not merely punish the act, it erases the alternative. Perhaps the elaborate fantasy worlds he constructed on stage, the palaces, the ballrooms, the stories of love thwarted and redeemed, were not merely entertainment, but survival, the only way a man forbidden to live truthfully could live at all. Perhaps the glamour he manufactured for others was compensation for what he was denied in his own existence. If so, then the nation that criminalized his love also, inadvertently, benefited from it, an irony so bitter it hardly bears examination. What we know is this. He was born in Cardiff on a January day in 1893, and he was given a borrowed name and a remarkable face, and a gift for melody that came as naturally as breathing. He was raised by a woman who loved him ferociously and controlled him absolutely. He loved a man named Bobby Andrews for 35 years, in silence, in secret, in the full knowledge that the law considered their bond a felony. He wrote songs that a nation sang in its darkest hours. He built a world of romance and spectacle on the stages of the West End, a world so luminous and so fragile that it could not survive his absence. He was sent to prison for a trivial offence that was not the real reason he was punished. He came back. He kept working. He kept smiling. He died above a theatre in the early hours of a March morning, with the man he loved beside him and the hush of an empty auditorium below. This is a life, not a symbol, not a cautionary tale, not a case study in the history of sexuality or the sociology of fame, though it is all of these things too. It is, first and most irreducibly, a life, lived in a particular time, under particular constraints, with particular joys and particular griefs. A human life, with all the mess and contradiction and stubborn, irrational loveliness that the phrase implies. Today, if you walk along Aldwych in central London, that curving street where the theatres cluster and the taxis queue and the tourists consult their phones with the bewildered concentration of people who suspect they are lost, you will come to a building with the name Novello above its entrance. It is a handsome building, as theatres go. Edwardian facade, classical proportions, the quiet confidence of a culture that believes in the importance of what happens on a stage. Inside, a show is running. It may be a musical, or a play, or a revival, or one of those hybrid productions that defy easy classification. Whatever it is, the audience has come for the same reason audiences have always come: to sit in the dark and watch other people's lives unfold, to feel things they cannot feel elsewhere, to be transporting for 2 hours, out of their own existence and into something larger, stranger, more vivid. They take their seats. The house lights dim. That particular hush descends, the collective intake of breath, the shared surrender of skepticism, the unspoken agreement between performer and spectator that, for the duration, the lies on stage will be truer than the truths outside. Above their heads, one floor up, behind a door that is no longer marked and windows that no longer open onto the life they once framed, the rooms are quiet. The flat where Novello lived and worked and loved and died has been absorbed into the building's infrastructure, offices perhaps, or storage, or nothing at all. The piano is gone. The teacups are gone. The manuscript paper, the programs, the photographs, the small accumulated evidence of a life shared by two people who were never permitted to share it publicly, all gone. The walls remain, but walls without their inhabitants are just geometry. They describe a space. They do not remember what filled it. And yet, if buildings could speak, if the plaster and the brick and the old timber beams could give testimony, what would these walls say? They would speak of music, first of all. Melodies composed in the small hours, played softly so as not to disturb the theatre below, refined and revised until they achieved the effortless quality that only relentless effort produces. They would remember laughter, the easy laughter of a man who was, by every account, genuinely warm company, possessed of the rare ability to make others feel they were the most interesting person in the room. They would confess to fear, the low-grade, perpetual, corrosive fear of exposure, the dread that turns every knock at the door into a potential catastrophe and every unfamiliar face into a threat. And they would, if walls could whisper of love. Not the grand, operatic love that Novello staged 8 times a week, not the love of exiled kings and Viennese countesses, not the love that resolves itself in a final chord and a slow curtain. The other kind, the kind that manifests as a cup of tea brought without being asked, the kind that waits outside a prison gate, the kind that sits across a table in a visiting room and communicates everything through the proximity of hands that do not touch, the kind that endures for 35 years without a contract, without a ceremony, without a single legal right, sustained by nothing more than the mutual decision, renewed every morning, to remain. Bobby Andrews knew this love. He lived inside it. He died 25 years later, still inside it. The world did not record his grief because the world did not recognize his right to grieve. He was a supporting player in someone else's narrative, and when the narrative ended, he walked off into an obscurity from which he has never emerged. This is perhaps the deepest injustice in two lives that contained no shortage of it, that the person who mattered most was the person who was noticed least. If you leave the theatre and travel north, through Bloomsbury, past the terraces and the squares, through neighbourhoods that grow quieter and greener as the city loosens its grip, you will eventually reach Golders Green. The crematorium there is a peaceful place, set among gardens designed to comfort the living as much as to honour the dead. Paths wind between flower beds and memorial plaques. Birds sing with the aggressive cheerfulness of creatures unbothered by human sorrow. The air smells of earth and rain, and in season of flowers. Among the gardens there is a lilac bush. It is not the largest, nor the most prominent. It does not announce itself. You could walk past it a dozen times without stopping, without noticing the small plaque set into the ground at its base, without reading the 5 words inscribed there. Till you are home once more. The lilac blooms in May. For a few weeks each spring, the bush erupts in clusters of purple and white, dense, conical flower heads that look, from a distance, like something between a chandelier and a prayer. The fragrance is extraordinary, sweet, heavy, almost narcotic, the kind of scent that stops you mid-stride and makes you turn your head and search for its source. It fills the air around the plaque, saturating the small patch of ground where what remains of Ivor Novello has rested for more than 70 years. Someone, now and then, stops. A visitor to the crematorium, perhaps, searching for a different grave and finding this one by accident. Or a music lover who has heard the name on an awards program and grown curious enough to trace it back to its origin. Or simply a person who likes lilac and pauses to breathe in the scent and happens to glance downward and reads the words and wonders who they were for and what they meant and whether the person they addressed ever did come home. The answer, of course, is no. He did not come home. Home, for Ivor Novello, was always a provisional arrangement, a flat above a stage, a country house where the rules were briefly suspended, an island in the Caribbean where 2 men could sit together without calculation. Home was not a place but a condition, and the condition was always temporary, always contingent, always subject to revocation by a world that granted him applause but withheld permission to be whole. But the lilac does not know this. The lilac is not interested in the complications of 20th century law or the particular cruelty of a society that celebrates a man's gift whilst criminalizing his heart. The lilac is interested in rain and sunlight and the slow, annual work of pushing color out of bare wood. It blooms because that is what lilac does. It fills the air with sweetness because that is its nature. It does not ask whether anyone is listening. It does not require an audience. It simply is present, fragrant, brief, radiant, in a way that the man beneath it never quite managed to be. Every spring, the scent rises. Every spring, for a few weeks, the air around that small plaque carries a sweetness that might, if you were inclined to such thoughts, remind you of a melody, something half-remembered, something you heard once and cannot quite place, something that makes you want to stop walking and stand still and listen for a voice that is no longer there. We'll gather lilacs in the spring again. That was the promise. It was written by a man who understood, perhaps better than anyone, that some promises are made not to be kept, but to be needed, needed as proof that the human heart, despite everything, despite the laws and the locks and the long silence, still believes in the possibility of return. He did not return, but the lilac still blooms.